Привет, это Навальный, и хочу сейчас сказать очень серьезную вещь.
Welcome up. For some, a political opposer, for others, just a YouTuber. Who is Alexei Navalny? I've talked about this with the editorial director of his journal, Martina Napolitano. Let's watch it together.
Alexei Navalny is quite a controversial figure. Alexei is in his 40s, has a model family, and differs from the usual Kremlin bureaucrats seen as being a rebel, sort of. He's been a great speaker, and as a lawyer, he knows how important it is to have a perfect oratory. He's been successful also in playing on his own image, creating a sort of brand of himself, and we know that the Russian society is very dependent on the exterior appearance, on the image, especially if we consider the t-shirts and the calendars with the bare-chested President Putin everywhere. So Navalny's success is found in his being the main voice in the fight against the corruption, which we know is endemic and deep in Russia as a result of the last Soviet decades of that Soviet crony system. It was Navalny who popularized the successful definition of Putin's party Единая Россия, United Russia, as the Партия жуликов и воров, the party of crooks and thieves. Well, actually, Navalny's political career began when he joined the Liberal Party Yabloko, which means apple, the last bastion of real systemic opposition that could have changed things in Russia until it was in the Duma parliament. The Yabloko party, however, in 2007 expelled Navalny because of his, some of his stances. In fact, Navalny embodies the new ideological trend of the so-called National Democrats, that is, liberal and democratic force, which is, however, also deeply xenophobic. For example, back in 2011, Navalny participated in famous protests that had real racist overtones, including the famous Russian March in Moscow and the Stop Feeding the Caucasus campaign, which featured Islamophobic slogans. Navalny emphasized that he wanted to talk about the endemic corruption in the North Caucasus, and he was asking the Kremlin to stop sending money to these regions. And however, the more appropriate catchphrase would have been "stop feeding the regime." Furthermore, Navalny has also repeatedly proposed the introduction of visas on the basis that these immigrants apparently are, in his own opinion, responsible for much criminality in Russia and particularly in Moscow.
Well, we cannot avoid talking about the elephant in the room. Navalny's boosting popularity is due to his poisoning. Can we formulate cautious hypotheses on why it happened? Didn't they expect it to backfire even if they succeeded in killing him?
Well, we've been watching this in so many cases already. The Kremlin has no fear whatsoever about taking actions of any kind. I would like to mention here the death of Boris Nemtsov in February 2015, another non-systemic opposition figure, by the way, close to Navalny himself, and who seemed at the time like a finished politician. As far as we are concerned by Navalny's figures, he also does not seem to have any actual hopes in replacing President Putin, but it is worth, according to Putin himself and to the government, to try and to block his way in any way. Well, legally, the government has been doing this since 2014, when Alexei Navalny, along with his brother Oleg, were convicted for fraud. His brother Oleg served his time in prison while Navalny was put under house arrest. And what did Navalny in that case? He posted a photo of the cut-off electronic bracelet that he was given due to the house arrest and used this opportunity for some self-advertisement purposes then. On a linguistic level, which is quite interesting to notice, if we look at Putin's discourse, Navalny is never mentioned. He's always defined by epithets like «тот персонаж», that character, or the известный блогер, the famous blogger. So in this sense, in Putin's discourse, Navalny does not really exist.
But based on what is measured a political opponent in an authoritarian country like Russia?
And today's Russia is really easy to become an opposer in a broad sense. Just a post on social media is enough, or if you're a teacher a lesson, or if you take on the streets in an unauthorized march, or if you're a journalist and you're critical of the government, if you have an NGO, if you run an NGO or an association and you receive foreign funding, therefore being branded as a foreign agent. So it's really easy to become an opposer whatsoever. In recent years, the laws regarding civil liberties and civil rights in Russia have increased in number, and now they're also affecting the web, the internet, which until recently was still a rather free and open reality in Russia.
But lately we hear the expression Navalny's Russia as opposed to Putin's Russia. But does Navalny have supporters in Russia?
We cannot say that Navalny holds a strong electoral base supporting him. According to a poll conducted last September by Levada Center, certainly today his name is known to more than 80% of the surveyed sample in Russia, while in 2013 almost 60% of Russian people did know Navalny and never heard of his name. However, exactly half of the respondents still do not support Navalny in his activities, and only 10% of the respondents say that respect him for his politics. In general, we can assume that at hypothetical elections, he would not collect more than 4%. The people that we see taking to the streets actually do so for a broader set of reasons, and not because they support Navalny in particular. Even though the protests arose out of Navalny's invitation, they embraced the demands that Russian protesters have been bringing to the streets for years now, and that more generally concern the aversion towards the Putin presidency, the repression of civil rights, and so on and so forth. So they should not be interpreted as an expression of widespread support of Russian citizens to Navalny. And in short, I would sum up it as Navalny now remains an opposer of Mr. Putin more abroad in Western countries than at home.
Navalny chose to go back to Russia knowing that he would be arrested. Can we see this as a strategical move to boost his popularity while drawing the attention on the human rights condition in Russia?
Well, for his part, Navalny was right upon landing when he said, "I have arrived home and I am not afraid." He certainly has nothing to lose, except for his life, of course. Politically, if he still wants to have a political chance in Russia, he had to come back. And the poisoning affair has, paradoxically, if you want, given him a real qualitative improvement in terms of popularity, support, and appreciation.
Can we make a comparison on the opposed strategy of Navalny going back to Russia and Tikhanovskaya remaining exiled from Belarus? Which movement is going to last more?
Well, we can hope that the protests in Russia will last every week till September, when there will be the Duma elections. In Belarus, the protests have slowed down, also due to winter, and Lukashenko seems to be resisting. However, economically, Belarus will not go on for long, and Minsk will have to ask for a loan. Not being able to turn to international bodies, it will have to do so in Moscow. At that moment, the knife will be in the hands of the Kremlin, which will be able to assess whether to continue to deal with Lukashenko within the friendship has long since broken down, or choose to listen to the Belarusian people and in some way support the change at the top. Of course, it is still risky for Moscow because it could give the Russian people a way to believe that protesting eventually leads to change.